Good morning, crime community. I've been sort of confused about Catherine Maria Sedgwick and Maria Edgewood. That's because they both have Maria in their first names. It's like Natalie Wood. She couldn't sing, so they replaced her, and then you ended up with two Marias. So now I got two Marias here, and one of them is edited by Mary Kelly. It's The Power of Her Sympathy, which is Maria Sedgwick, edited by Mary Kelly. And then I ordered another book where Mary Kelly talks about Maria Edgeworth. So I don't know where to begin between these two authors because they really were competitors. So I'm just going to try to read a little bit of it and see if we can learn anything about this relationship. Clarence, in transatlantic context, Maria Edgeworth and Captain Basil Hall. As Lawrence Buell observed in American literary emergence as a post-colonial phenomenon, earlier 19th century American authors had to reckon with an extensive discourse of American produced by Europeans who observed Americans with a kind of colonial condensation. Writing from within a recently colonial culture and sharing a language with their former rulers, American authors both anticipated a transcontinental readership and imagined foreign as well as native opinion in ways that had textual consequences. Buell's examples derive exclusively from works of male authors, such as Cooper's rewriting of The Hope of General Protagonist, cum vernacular sidekick, and Sir Walter Scott's Waverley novels, by making frontiersman Natty Bumppo his hero. While the novelist known as the American Scott rewrote Waverley and anticipated the actively sought British readers, Sedgwick, the American Edgeworth, revised Belinda in 1801 by Anglo-Irish novelist Maria Edgeworth and sought British novelers for it. By arranging a British edition of her novel, Sedgwick simultaneously sought a broad audience in Britain and delivered a point rejoinder in the colonial condensation directed at her by Edgeworth and Edgeworth's friend, the British naval officer and travel writer Captain Basil Hall. Writing back to Edgeworth and Hall and their assumptions about the lack of manners, social distinction, and fashion in American society, Sedgwick launched the American Novels of Manners. Sedgwick's transatlantic address to Edgeworth and British audiences began 8 years earlier at the inception of her career by dedicating A New England Tale, her first novel, to Maria Edgeworth as a slight expression of the writer's sense of her eminent services in the great cause of humanity. Sedgwick signaled that she knew Edgeworth's body of work and modeled her own authorial persona on Edgeworth's. Sedgwick clearly found Edgeworth an admirable model. Born and raised in the western Massachusetts village of Stockbridge, Sedgwick remained single so she could devote her attention to her siblings and their families. Singularly, Edgeworth devoted herself to her father and her younger half-siblings on the Edgeworth estate in rural Ireland. The beginning of Sedgwick's career coincided with her conversations from Calvinist-inflected Protestantarian to Unitarian Christianity and Edgeworth's didacticism and promotion of rational morality in her work suited Sedgwick's embrace of the enlightened rationale and liberal faith. Sedgwick and other American readers had easy access to Edgeworth's work because U.S. publishers began reprinting them in the 19th century. In 1842, the Boston firm of Wells and Lilly published the first American edition of Belinda as part of the collected edition of Etherington's works, and S.H. Parker of Boston did the same a decade later. A London collected edition of Edgeworth's works would not appear until 1832. Sedgwick's likely first read, Belinda, in Wells and Lilly's edition, a borrowing from Belinda's in Sedgwick the Travelers, a tale designed for young people, 1825, provides evidence of her reading. Reminiscent of Edgeworth's work for children, The Travelers embeds as a backstory for a minor character of truncated version of a striking subplot from Belinda, Clarence Harvey's quixotic plan to raise a young woman as the ideal wife for himself. By arranging a London edition of New England Tale with publisher John Miller, Sedgwick increased the likelihood that the novel would find its way into Edgeworth's hands so that she might respond to the dedication addressed to her. Initially, Edgeworth accepted Sedgwick's invitation. By the fall of 1823, Sedgwick had received a letter from Edgeworth, now lost, which circulated among Sedgwick's family and friends. As she wrote to her close friend and frequent correspondent, Eliza Lee Cabot, with assumed modesty, I have received a letter from Miss Edgeworth. I have rather had one of your letters, but still is a very gratifying circumstance to such a humble personage as I am. By the time Sedgwick received Edgeworth's letter, composition of her second novel, Redwood, which specifically references emulets and revises Edgeworth's Irish novel, The Absentee of 1812, as well as underway, once again, Sedgwick arranged a London edition, which appeared not long after the New York edition. Both Edgeworth and Sedgwick maintained multiple transatlantic correspondences, so one might expect that Edgeworth's 1823 letter would have inaugurated a continually epistolary relationship in the context of which Edgeworth would have responded to Redwood. Instead, she communicated indirectly, recording a response and conveying advice to Sedgwick in a letter to Rachel Mordecai Lazarus, a Jewish schoolteacher in South Carolina. Lazarus, a perfect stranger to Sedgwick, when composed these messages and Edgeworth's letters to her own letter to Sedgwick, Lazarus had initiated her own correspondence with Edgeworth the previous decade when she wrote to protest Edgeworth's stereotypical portrayal of Jews in her fiction. As their correspondence and long-distance friendship grew, Lazarus sent American books to Edgeworth, and she wrote to Edgeworth in 1824 about reading a positive review of Redwood. Several months later, she sent a copy to Edgeworth along with her enthusiastic praise of it, demurring only against Sedgwick's portrayal of the condition of slaves in Virginia. Edgeworth took advantage of this opening to use Lazarus as an intermediary. Edgeworth's choice in the indirect address to Sedgwick via Lazarus produced a distinctive passive-aggressive result. Passing to Lazarus, and she enjoyed Redwood and the flattered to mention of her works. In the novel, Edgeworth praises the character Deborah Lennox as first-rate in Scott's best manner, yet not an imitation of Scott. From praise, however, she moves quickly to advise the smacks of colonial condensation, advising that America, unlike Scotland, had no tradition that might be made the subject of historical fiction in the manner of Scott. She advises Sedgwick to write about the present rather than the past. Although the present is also the domain of the novel of manners, she warned Sedgwick against portraying society and fashion, particularly European characters, because English critics and female readers will pass judgment on misrepresentations of the shades and minute particulars of fashion that will inevitably elude a transatlantic writer. The sting of Lazarus's letter conveying Edgeworth's advice was likely soothed by a letter Sedgwick received virtually simultaneously from her friend Catherine Norton, excerpting a letter from British poet Felicia Hemans. Miss Sedgwick's writings are both honorable to her sex, full of high feeling, of moral beauty. Hemans wrote, bestowing particular praise on Redwood. Hemans opines Miss Sedgwick's lofty standard of morality might give an useful lesson to Miss Edgeworth. These works, though excellent, yet appeal far more to worldly prudence than to any nobler motive of action. Bolstered by the transatlantic flattery, Sedgwick responded graciously to Edgeworth's criticism, writing via Lazarus that Edgeworth's sentiments rewarded her past exertion and would encourage her in the future, that she felt inferior to the task of writing. Sedgwick explained, and some of her most intelligent friends believed that America's early history was the best subject matter for fiction, and she seemingly concedes that she lacked the necessary touch of a magician to body forth the shadows of the past. She further reinforced the unsensible concession of sending Lazarus a copy of The Deformed Boy, 1826, a pathetic little story found, in fact, as Lazarus wrote approvingly to Edgeworth, which Sedgwick had written for the benefit of the Benevolent Society. Sedgwick claimed to be much impressed with Edgeworth's advice. However, the letter which Lazarus probably copied and sent to Edgeworth deployed a pointed irony invisible to Lazarus and Edgeworth, who had no way of knowing that Sedgwick was nearly done writing for her first historical novel, Hope Leslie, in which she emulated and revised Scott's Ivanhoe. Its critical and popular success would prove Edgeworth wrong about American history as subject matter for fiction. Edgeworth's condescending advice of 1826 became as notorious in Sedgwick's family and social circle as Edgeworth's letter of 1823. Well over a year after she received Lazarus's letter, Catherine refused to it in a letter to her brother Harry, for which she forwarded a letter from Swiss economist and historian Jean-Charles Leonard de Sismondi praising Hope Leslie. Such a letter to an obscure, unknown individual from a man so distinguished and so occupied in his career of letters, in a proof of the most kind of generous disposition, how different from Miss Edgeworth. She certainly belongs in a class of egotists. In late 1827, Sedgwick, also smarting from an encounter from another British egotist who found American culture vulgar, Captain Basil Hall, in his American travels of 1827 to 1828, undertaken with the intention of writing a travel book. Hall, his wife, and younger daughter met the Sedgwick family on a visit to Stockbridge. As he describes his purpose in the preface in Travels in North America, 1829, he wanted to see things with my own eyes, and in order to ascertain my personal inspection, and far the sentiments prevailed in England, and respect with that country were correct or otherwise, despite his posture of open-mindedness, he was, as Alice Hiller points out, a conservative Tory who slanted his reportage the better to discredit the practice of democracy in the run-up of political reform in England. When in the course of his travels, Hall complained that the excesses of American democracy and lack of social cultivation had seen in eastern seaboard cities, his acquaintances exhorted, "Go to our flourishing villages, sir, and talk to our farmers. You will see our character. You will find the high-minded and intelligent citizens of our country." In this account of his visit to Stockbridge, he writes admirably of the more wealthy class of the village residents, including the accomplished author of several admirable works of fancy, Redwood, Hope Leslie, and others. However, he devotes far more space in lampooning a celebration of the 4th anniversary of the Agricultural Society, despite this flattering published mention of Sedgwick on the evening of his departure from Stockbridge. Hall sent a letter cataloging the vulgarisms of Hope Leslie's language and criticisms her depiction of immoral characters, scenes, and incidents. He particularly objected to the character of Rosa, rejected paramour of Sir Philip Gardiner, who disguises herself as a boy in order to travel with him as his page. Sedgwick responded to his criticism by vigorously defending her American idiom and the morality of her fiction. Significantly, Hall, a Scotsman, was Maria Edgeworth's friend, and he carried letters of introduction from her to Rachel Lazarus, whom he did not meet, and Philadelphia author Mary Griffin, who he did. Notably, Griffith was both Edgeworth's transatlantic correspondent and Sedgwick's friend. As Sedgwick wrote to her brother Harry in the same letter, in which she characterized Edgeworth as an egotist, "I wish you could see Edgeworth's letter of introduction to Captain Hall and Mrs. Griffith, and as a subsequent one, Captain Hall does me the honor and pleasure to permit me to introduce him to you. And have you seen the captain? Have you heard him talk? Have your friends heard him?" And then quite a rant about his fine powers. Miss Edgeworth must be the Americans just up to the level of Mr. Johnson's requisition for a female traveling companion. No one think Hall equal to Mad de Stael or Napoleon. That ends our lesson for today about Miss Sedgwick. Steve will be getting some more books by Mrs. Powers, so he can talk about Mrs. Edgeworth some more. So there's definitely a competition between these two women, and I don't know what it's about. I don't think the Friends of the Library know what it's about, because they're not letting me know either. So we will just continue on with our studies, and if you think there's any truth to what I'm doing here, please like and subscribe, and have a great day.